The most powerful man on the Texas frontier, a rancher, a skilled gunman, a man feared by the entire region, married a woman the whole town despised. No one understood why. They laughed, they whispered, they bet the marriage would ruin his career within a year. But none of them knew what Colt Mercer saw from the very beginning, that the woman they called a burden was the only one who could save the entire land. Follow the story to the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The morning Colt Mercer rode into Harlan's Crossing with Maeve Holloway sitting beside him on the buckboard, the town stopped moving. Not all at once. It happened the way most things happened in small frontier settlements. One person noticed, then nudged another, and within the time it took for the wagon wheels to roll from the general store to the end of the main thoroughfare, there were at least 30 people standing on the boardwalks and in doorways, watching in silence that felt more like held breath than politeness. Colt didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, jaw set, hands loose on the reins the way they always were. Unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had already made his decisions and wasn't interested in revisiting them. He wore the same weathered duster he'd worn for 6 years, the same crease of dust along his collar, the same expression that had convinced more than one difficult man to reconsider his position. Maeve looked at all of them. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't try to make herself smaller, which was something people later remarked on because making herself smaller would have required genuine effort. Maeve Holloway was a large woman, not soft in the way people meant when they used that word to be cruel, but substantial in the way that a good piece of timber was substantial, the kind of presence that took up space and didn't apologize for it. She had a wide face, strong hands reddened from years of actual work, and dark brown hair pinned back without particular vanity. She wore a blue cotton dress that had been washed so many times the color had shifted toward gray, and she sat straight-backed on the wagon seat as though she were arriving somewhere she had every right to be, which, legally speaking, she was. They'd been married 4 days earlier in Caldwell County, with a circuit preacher and 2 witnesses whose names neither of them could fully remember afterward. It had been a practical arrangement, made quickly and without ceremony, which matched the personalities of both parties involved. Still, Harlan's Crossing had opinions. "Is that—" someone started near the dry goods store. "That's Mercer's wagon," someone else confirmed in the tone people use when they're watching a fire and waiting to see which direction it'll spread. A boy of maybe 11 or 12, sitting on a fence post at the edge of the road, stared openly as the buckboard rolled past. He had his mouth hanging open just slightly. Maeve caught his eye and gave him a firm nod, the kind a school teacher might give a student she'd already decided she wasn't going to tolerate nonsense from. The boy shut his mouth and looked away. They passed the livery, past the post office, past the saloon where 3 men had stepped out onto the porch, with their drinks still in hand. One of them, a man named Deke Pruitt, who ran cattle north of town and had once made Colt an offer on the Hollow Creek parcel, let out a sound that started as a laugh and ended as something he probably thought was wit. "Well, Mercer," Deke called out, "she comes with acreage, does she?" The laughter that followed was the open kind, not even trying to disguise itself. Colt's hands tightened on the reins for exactly 1 second, then he released them. Maeve said nothing. She looked straight ahead, and something in her expression went very still and very quiet, the way deep water goes quiet when you've thrown a stone in and the ripples have finished. They didn't stop in town. They passed straight through and took the eastern fork toward the Hollow Creek property, which Colt had inherited 8 months ago from his uncle Silas, a man who had spent 2 decades doing the bare minimum to keep the land from reverting to the county, and had ultimately succeeded only in dying before it became someone else's problem entirely. The Hollow Creek Ranch was, charitably speaking, a mess. Maeve didn't say so when they pulled up to the main house that afternoon, though she thought it loudly enough that Colt might have been able to hear it if he'd been paying attention. The house itself was structurally sound, but had not been painted in so long that the wood had gone silver gray in the Texas sun, and one corner of the porch had settled at an angle that suggested the foundation beneath it had given up and was working through the stages of grief. The barn was bigger than the house, which wasn't unusual in ranching country, but half the corral fence was missing boards, and the pasture beyond it had been overgrazed down to hard, cracked dirt. There were 6 hired hands in total, already on the property when they arrived. They came out of the barn and the bunkhouse slowly, the way men do when they haven't decided yet whether what they're seeing requires an attitude adjustment. Colt introduced Maeve briefly, using her name and the word wife and nothing else, and the men nodded or tipped their hats in varying degrees of sincerity. One of them, a young man named Pete Grady, with sunburned ears and the eager, slightly nervous look of someone who hadn't been around long enough to develop cynicism, said, "Welcome, ma'am," and meant it. The others said it because they were expected to. The oldest hand, a weathered man named Rudd, who had been with the property under Silas and had apparently survived the transition by making himself essential and invisible in equal measure, looked at Maeve for a long moment, looked at Colt, looked back at Maeve, and said nothing at all, which communicated more than most speeches. Colt showed Maeve through the house, which took about 15 minutes because the house was not large. 2 bedrooms, a main room, a kitchen that had a stove needing repair, and shelves that had not been stocked in a meaningful way in some time. The window over the kitchen basin looked out toward the dry pasture, and beyond it, the line of dead scrub brush that marked where Hollow Creek itself ran, or rather, where it had run, before 2 consecutive drought years had reduced it to a string of muddy, disconnected pools. "Tell me what you see," Colt said, standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed. Maeve turned from the window. "I see a lot of problems." "Tell me the worst one." "Water," she said, without hesitating. "Everything else is bad, but water is the reason the previous cattle operations failed. No reliable water, no way to keep animals through a dry season. The creek's intermittent at best. If we're going to run cattle here at scale, we need water that doesn't depend on rain." Colt looked at her steadily. "What would you do about it?" "I'd need to walk the land before I could answer that properly," Maeve said. "I've been reading about subsurface water collection. There are methods being used in drier regions that don't require running water. Cisterns, angled catch systems, knowing where the low points are when rain does come so you can hold it instead of losing it downstream." She paused. "I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying it's possible, and it's the first problem we'd have to solve before anything else makes sense." Colt nodded. He didn't say anything else about it that evening. Word traveled the way it always did in ranching country, which was faster than wire and less accurate than rumor deserved to be. By the end of the first week, Harlan's Crossing had already generated several competing theories about why Colt Mercer had married the woman. None of the theories were particularly kind to Maeve, and several of them weren't particularly kind to Colt either, implying various failures of judgment or desperation or both. The most popular version, circulating primarily through the women who gathered at Hetty Blythe's dressmaking shop on Thursdays, was that Maeve had some kind of inheritance that Colt needed access to and that he'd calculated it was worth the embarrassment. Hetty herself was the one who said it most directly when a young woman named Clara Aldridge asked what she thought of the whole situation. "Mercer's always been practical," Hetty said, not unkindly toward Colt specifically. "That property's drowning in debt and everyone knows it. A man in that position starts looking at options he might not otherwise consider." "But to marry—" Clara started. "It's a transaction," Hetty said, with the finality of someone who believed she understood human nature completely. "Same as buying a mule. You don't necessarily enjoy it, you just need it to pull the plow." The comparison got repeated. It always does when something is that perfectly mean. What Hetty and Clara and the other women in that shop didn't know, what almost no one in Harlan's Crossing knew, was that Maeve had no inheritance worth speaking of. She'd come from a hill country family that had worked hard and died hard and left very little behind except the habit of working. She'd spent 8 years managing the household accounts and supply logistics for her father's struggling farm, then 4 years doing the same thing for a county surveying company until the owner died and the company dissolved. She had a thorough education in land, water rights, crop cycles, and the mathematics of keeping an operation alive on margins that would make most men quit. She had knowledge, experience, and a mind that worked in the particular way that practical intelligence works. Not the kind that impresses people at dinner tables, but the kind that notices things other people walk past and asks questions other people don't think to ask. Colt had recognized it the first time he'd spoken to her at length, at a land auction outside Caldwell, where she'd been there on behalf of the surveying company she worked for, and he'd been there to figure out whether a particular parcel was worth bidding on. She'd told him it wasn't, with specific reasons he hadn't considered, and she'd been right. He'd lost the parcel to a competitor who paid too much for land that turned out to have drainage problems in wet seasons. He'd thought about that conversation for months afterward, when the Hollow Creek property came to him and he understood what it was: a failing operation in a drought-prone territory, requiring the kind of thinking he was honest enough to admit he didn't fully possess. He'd gone back to Caldwell and found Maeve Holloway again and had a very direct conversation about what he needed and what he was offering in return. It had not been romantic. Colt Mercer was not a romantic man and hadn't pretended otherwise. "I need a partner," he'd told her. "Someone who understands land and water and supply logistics and can think 3 seasons ahead. The property's in bad shape. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. What I can offer is a legal share of whatever we build, a house, and my word that I'll listen when you talk." Maeve had looked at him for a long time. "That last part," she'd said finally. "Do you mean it, or are you saying it because you think it's what I want to hear?" "I mean it," he'd said. "I've never been good at saying things I don't mean. Ask anyone." She'd thought about it for 3 days and then sent word that she'd accept. It was, in its way, a reasonable arrangement between 2 people who needed different things from each other and were both clear-eyed enough to say so. What neither of them had fully mapped was that clarity, over time, could become something that looked almost like trust, and that trust, unexpectedly applied, could turn into something neither of them had particularly planned for. But that was later. The first month was harder than either of them had anticipated, which was saying something because neither of them had anticipated anything easy. The 6 hands were a problem Maeve identified quickly. Of the 6, only 3 were actually useful. Pete Grady, who was young but willing, a quiet man named Amos who knew cattle the way some people knew music, with an ear for the small signs that something was off, and a man named Hector, who was older than Rudd, but had the kind of steady physical competence that meant things got done when he was given a direction. The other 3 were Rudd and 2 men named Calloway and Sim, who were performing just enough work to avoid being dismissed, but were clearly watching the situation with the calculated patience of men who had outlasted employers before and expected to outlast these ones too. Maeve said nothing about this to Colt for 2 weeks. She watched, and she cataloged what she saw. On the 16th day, she asked Colt to walk the property line with her, the full perimeter, which took most of the morning. And as they walked, she described what she'd observed about each of the 6 men, specifically and without editorializing, and then she described what she thought they should do about it. "Rudd and the other 2, Colt said. "They've been on this property longer than anyone." "Tenure isn't the same as loyalty," Maeve said, "and it isn't the same as work. Rudd's primary skill right now is making the other 2 look busy. Calloway hasn't repaired the east fence section he was assigned 8 days ago. Sim spends about 40 minutes out of every hour doing something other than what he was assigned." Colt was quiet. They were walking along the dry creek bed, boots scuffing through the hard-packed soil, the sun already getting aggressive by mid-morning. "You've been keeping track," he said finally. "I've been paying attention," Maeve said. "I thought that was why you wanted me here." Something shifted in his expression, not discomfort exactly, something more like reassessment. "All right," he said. "What would you do?" "I'd let Rudd go first," Maeve said. "The other 2 will either step up or show themselves when he's not there to set the pace. If they step up, we've solved half the problem. If they don't, we let them go too and start looking for people who actually want to be somewhere. Rudd'll make noise about it in town." "He's already making noise about it in town," Maeve said. "People who intend to make noise do it regardless of what you give them. Keeping him won't buy us quiet." Colt stopped walking. He looked out at the creek bed, at the scatter of muddy pools that passed for water in a drought year, at the pale sky that offered no immediate promises. He rubbed the back of his neck. "All right," he said again. Rudd was let go the following morning. He made noise about it exactly the way Maeve had predicted, telling everyone in Harlan's Crossing that Colt Mercer was being run by his wife, that the woman didn't know the first thing about real ranching, that the whole operation would fold before summer's end, and he was glad to be out of it before it did. Calloway quit 2 days later, which solved that problem on its own. Sim, to everyone's minor surprise, including his own, stepped up. It was in the third week that Maeve began doing the thing that would eventually make her both respected and resented across 3 counties, though she had no particular awareness of either effect at the time. She simply started walking. Every evening after supper, while there was still light, she walked sections of the property. She took a notebook, a plain brown one she'd bought from the general store in Harlan's Crossing, and during the pointed silence of the shopkeeper's wife, and she wrote down what she saw. The angle of the ground, the location of every natural depression, where the scrub brush grew in the driest years because the vegetation told you things about what was beneath the surface if you knew how to read it, where the hard pan ended and the soil shifted to something more permeable, where the shade fell in the afternoon and for how long. She walked in boots that were too tight because her feet were wide, and the only pair she'd been able to find in Harlan's Crossing that fit at all were a half-size small, and she didn't say anything about them for 3 weeks until Colt noticed her walking stiff one evening and asked what was wrong. "Boots," she said. He looked at her feet. "How long?" "Since I got here." "Maeve." The way he said her name was not particularly tender, but it wasn't impatient either. It was just her name, weighted with the particular exasperation of someone who has just realized a problem existed that he could have fixed weeks ago if he'd known about it. "You should have said." "I should have bought better boots," Maeve said. "I'll go to Caldwell next week. They have a larger selection." "I'll go with you." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Colt said. "I'll go with you." He did. The shopkeeper in Caldwell was more accommodating, whether because he lacked the same social investment in the situation, or because Colt Mercer's presence tended to smooth certain transactions. Maeve found 2 pairs that fit properly. She wore 1 pair out of the store and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she could walk correctly. On the drive back, Colt said, "What are you finding?" "On the property walks." Maeve opened her notebook. She had developed, over the previous weeks, a system of small maps, rough but accurate, drawn in the close, precise hand of someone who'd done surveying work. She spread the most recent one across her knee. "There are 3 natural collection points," she said. "Here, here, and here." She pointed to spots marked with small circles. "When rain comes, even light rain, water moves toward these spots. Right now it sits for a few days and evaporates, or drains into the subsoil. If we build collection structures at each point, we can hold that water. I've been reading about cistern construction. Limestone and mortar, properly done, will hold through summer." Colt studied the map. He had a particular way of looking at information he found useful. Very still, absorbing it slowly, not rushing to speak. "How much would it cost?" "Less than losing another dry season's cattle," Maeve said. He looked at her. "That's not an answer." "I know, I haven't finished the full material calculation yet. Give me another week." He gave her another week. When she came back with the numbers, he went to Harlan's Crossing and ordered the limestone. The gossip about that was immediate and enthusiastic. Deke Prewitt heard about it from the limestone supplier, who was happy to share the information because Deke was a good customer and also because the whole situation had given the town something to talk about at a time when not much else was happening. Deke told 3 other cattlemen. By the time the story traveled its natural circuit, it had transformed from "Mercer is building water cisterns on the Hollow Creek property" to "Mercer's wife has him digging up the whole property based on some book she read." At the saloon, where a man named Harlan Bryce held court most evenings, Bryce ran the largest cattle operation in the county and had the kind of absolute confidence in his own judgment that only accumulates in men who have been right often enough that they've stopped tracking the times they weren't. The cistern story provoked a particular kind of amusement. "She's going to have him throw good money after bad," Bryce said, not with anger but with the mild satisfaction of a man who feels a situation confirming his pre-existing worldview. "Hollow Creek's been a dry year disaster for 20 years. You can't fix that with a shovel and a book." "Mercer's not stupid," someone offered. "No," Bryce agreed, "but he's distracted. Man gets married, and suddenly he's listening to someone who doesn't know the difference between reading about ranching and doing it." He shook his head with the look of a man who has seen this tragedy before. "Give it a season. He'll come around when the money runs out." What Bryce didn't factor in, and what most of the people making these calculations didn't factor in, was that Maeve's numbers were careful, conservatively careful, built with buffers, because she had spent enough years watching operations fail to understand that the math that fails first is always the math that assumed the best case. The cisterns they built that spring were not beautiful. They were rough-walled limestone structures, 3 of them, positioned in the 3 natural collection points she'd identified. She and Hector and Pete did most of the labor themselves over the course of 6 weeks, mixed in between the other necessary work of the ranch. Amos kept the cattle moving on a rotation Maeve had laid out. It was more walking than the animals were used to, and less time on each section of grazing land, and it felt counterproductive to people who'd been trained to think about grazing differently. But Maeve explained the logic. Let the grass recover instead of grazing it to bare dirt, and there'd be more of it by fall. "I've never seen it done this way," Amos said one afternoon, standing by the fence and watching the small herd move to a new section. "Has the old way been working?" Maeve asked. Amos thought about it. "No," he said finally. "Then it's worth trying something different," she said. Amos nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else about it, but after that, he followed the rotation precisely without being asked twice, and occasionally made suggestions that were thoughtful enough that Maeve started incorporating them into the plan. Rain came in April. Not much, but enough. 2 days of steady, modest rain that wouldn't have made a meaningful difference to the Hollow Creek property in previous years, draining off or pooling in useless places and disappearing within days. The cisterns collected 3/4 of their capacity. When Maeve walked out the morning after the rain stopped and stood at the edge of the first collection cistern and looked at the water level, she felt something she didn't have an easy name for. Not exactly triumph, too quiet for that. It was more like the feeling of knowing you've calculated something correctly. That particular cold clarity of a proof working out. Colt came and stood beside her without her hearing him approach, which was a habit of his that she'd mostly stopped finding startling. "That's water," he said. "That's water," she agreed. He looked at it for a moment, then he said quietly, "Good." It was not an extravagant acknowledgement, but it was real, and from Colt Mercer, real was worth considerably more than extravagant. What Maeve didn't say, standing there that morning, was how much she'd needed it to work. Not for the proof to the town, not even for the ranch, though both of those things mattered, but for the private internal calculation she'd been running since she'd arrived, the one where she asked herself on the worst evenings whether she'd made the right choice in coming here, whether she was actually as capable as she believed herself to be, or whether the voices in Harlan's Crossing were picking up on something true. The water in the cistern said something clear enough. She held on to it. Spring moved into the dry heat of early summer. The cattle, 23 head that had survived the previous year in better shape than most local operations because of the rotation schedule, were in condition to hold through the season with the supplemental water. Not comfortable, not ideal, but survivable. One evening in June, Colt came back from a supply run to find Pete Grady waiting outside the barn with a look on his face that meant something had happened. "Someone's moved the east fence markers," Pete said. Colt went still. "Moved them how?" "Back about 40 feet. Whoever did it was careful. Used new stakes, tried to match the look of the original line. Amos spotted it when he was doing the rotation check. The east fence line was the border with Deke Prewitt's property. The 40 feet, if the shifted markers stood, would cut a corner off one of the collection cisterns." Colt's expression did not change in any way that would have been described as dramatic. He simply stood and processed this for a moment. "Don't move anything," he said. "Leave the markers exactly where they are and don't touch the line." He went inside and found Maeve at the kitchen table with the account books. He told her what Pete had told him. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was a habit he'd come to appreciate because he'd spent too many years around people who started problem-solving before they'd heard the full problem. "Do you have the original survey documentation?" she asked when he was done. "Silas filed it with the county. I have a copy somewhere in the land papers." "Get it," Maeve said, "tonight. And in the morning, I want to walk the line with you and Amos and measure what's been moved exactly and document it." "Then what?" She looked at him steadily. "Then we go to the county land office with the survey and the documentation of the markers, and we file a formal record of the discrepancy. We don't confront Prewitt directly, we don't move his markers, we build a paper record." Colt was quiet. He had, Maeve had noticed a characteristic response to her laying out a strategy. He went quiet, which meant he was thinking rather than reacting, and that quality in him was one of the things she'd come to rely on. "People will say I'm afraid to settle it man to man," he said finally. "People who lose their land in legal disputes over fences they won in fistfights say that a lot," Maeve said. "Men who keep their land tend to be more interested in documentation." A corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. "Fair point." They documented it. They walked the line the following morning, all four of them, Colt, Maeve, Amos, and Pete, and Maeve measured and recorded and drew a careful map of the discrepancy. She compared it against the original survey copy, line by line, and the documentation she produced was thorough enough that when they took it to the county land office in Caldwell, the registrar looked at it for a long time and asked who had prepared it. "My wife," Colt said. The registrar looked at Maeve. Something in his expression recalibrated. "This is solid work," he said. They filed the formal record. The markers were restored to their legal positions 3 weeks later, via county notification to Prewitt, without a confrontation, without a public argument, without anyone's pride being directly engaged in a way that required escalation. Prewitt was furious in private. In public, there was nothing he could do because the documentation was airtight, which made him furious about that too. Back in Harlan's Crossing, people discussed it. Most framed it as a technicality. Mercer had won a paperwork argument, not a real one. Deke Prewitt told people he'd been the victim of an aggressive legal maneuver by a man who wasn't willing to settle things properly. Hetty Blythe said, in her shop, that she found the whole thing rather cold-blooded. Maeve heard about Hetty's comment secondhand through Pete Grady's wife when Maeve went to the general store. She thought about it on the walk home, 3 miles on the good boots she'd gotten in Caldwell, and decided that cold-blooded and effective were not, in her experience, incompatible. Warm blood had its virtues. So did keeping your land. By midsummer, they had added 4 more hands. This happened not through advertising or particularly active recruitment, but because word had traveled, the specific, practical kind of word that moves through ranch workers and drifting laborers, different from the social gossip of the town, that the Hollow Creek operation was unusual. It paid what it promised, which was not universal. It was expanding in a drought year when most operations were contracting, which was remarkable. And the woman who ran the day-to-day decisions made choices that made sense if you thought them through, even when they looked strange at first. 2 of the new hands came as a pair, brothers named Ellis and Thomas Crane, who had worked 3 other ranches in 2 years and quit 2 of them over unpaid wages. They showed up on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the yard looking slightly defensive, the way men do when they've been burned enough times that arriving somewhere new feels like a test they might already be failing. Maeve came out of the house and looked at them. "You know cattle?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Ellis said. He was the older one, stocky, with a careful watchfulness that Maeve recognized as hard-won. "You know fencing? We can do it." "The work here is not standard," she said. "The rotation schedule requires actual attention, not just following habit. The water management needs monitoring. If you're here, I need you to actually be here, not putting in hours and thinking about somewhere else." The 2 brothers exchanged a look. "We heard you pay on time," Thomas said. "Twice a month, exact," Maeve said. "The work is real, and the pay is real. If that's a fair trade, you're welcome." They stayed. Both of them, for considerably longer than either had stayed anywhere else. By the end of that first summer, the Hollow Creek operation had 8 workers, 3 functioning cisterns, a cattle herd in better condition than it had been in years, and a reputation in the surrounding territory that was still unkind in its framing, but had quietly shifted in its content. People were still saying Colt Mercer had made a strange choice. They just weren't saying the choice wasn't working. There was one evening in late August, the heat finally breaking just slightly, the air carrying the first tentative suggestion that the seasons might, eventually, change, when Colt and Maeve sat on the porch after supper. The porch that had once tilted at its troubling angle had been re-leveled in June. That was one of the early projects, done on a weekend with Hector's help, because a tilting porch was a hazard and also just deeply irritating to look at. They didn't always talk in the evenings. That was something they'd worked out early. That silence between them didn't require filling, which was a relief to both of them for different reasons. Colt had spent years around men who talked to fill space and found it exhausting. Maeve had spent years around people who expected her to be more cheerful than she felt and had found that exhausting in a different way. But that evening, Colt said, "You know what Prewitt said when the county sent the notification about the fence line?" Maeve waited. "He said the whole thing was engineered by someone who wasn't ranching. They were just playing at it." Colt's voice was level, not particularly heated. "Said you had book learning and no real understanding." "I know," Maeve said. "I've heard versions of that." "Does it bother you?" She considered this honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. "Yes," she said finally. "More than I'd like it to. Not because I think he's right, because I still have to hear it." Colt nodded. Across the dry pasture, the first full cistern caught the last of the evening light and held it dully, like something that didn't know it was being watched. The cattle were settled on the far rotation section, quiet in the heat. "He said something else," Colt continued. "He said I'd come to my senses eventually." Maeve looked at him. He was looking at the pasture, and his profile was the profile she'd come to recognize as his thinking expression. Not troubled, not pleased, just working something through. "I've already come to my senses," he said. "That's why I married you." It was not a speech, it was barely a sentence, but Maeve thought about it for several days afterward, in the quiet way she thought about things that mattered, turning it over and looking at it from different angles. Not with sentiment exactly, with something more like the recognition of a fact she hadn't previously calculated and was now incorporating into the model. Outside Harlan's Crossing, the summer burned toward its end. The cisterns held. The herd held. The property that everyone had predicted would collapse in the first year was moving, slowly and with considerable effort, in a different direction entirely. The people who had laughed weren't done laughing yet. They hadn't started paying attention in the right way. They hadn't understood, not yet, what Maeve Holloway had understood since the first morning she'd sat on that buckboard seat and felt their stares. That being underestimated, as long as you survived it, was its own kind of advantage. She intended to survive it. She intended to do considerably more than that. But for now, on the repaired porch of the gradually less failing Hollow Creek Ranch, she let the evening cool around her and didn't say any of that out loud. Some things were better kept close until you were ready to use them. Fall came to Hollow Creek the way it came to most of that part of Texas. Not with any dramatic announcement, but with a gradual shift in the quality of light, a cooling of the nights that the days pretended not to notice for another few weeks, and the particular dry smell of grasses that had survived the summer and weren't sure yet whether to be relieved about it. Maeve noticed it first on a morning in late September when she walked out to check the cisterns before breakfast and found the air carrying something different, less weight to it, less of the suffocating stillness that had defined August. She stood at the edge of the main cistern and looked at the water level, which had dropped through the summer but held well above what she'd projected as the minimum threshold, and felt the shift in the season the way she felt most things, as a fact to be incorporated, not a mood to be indulged. They had made it through the first summer. That was not nothing. The cattle herd was at 26 head now. They'd lost one to a fence accident in July and gained 4 from a small purchase Colt had negotiated in early August, a transaction Maeve had reviewed the numbers on and approved, which was a process they'd fallen into without either of them formally declaring it a process. He brought the numbers, she looked at them, they talked through the variables, and then he made the final decision because it was his name on the property deed, and he was clear-eyed enough to own that responsibility. It worked. Not perfectly, but well enough that they'd stopped examining the arrangement and simply used it. The question going into fall was whether the second season would break them before the first one's gains could compound, because the gains were real but they were fragile, and Maeve knew it in the careful, unsentimental way she knew most uncomfortable things. The cisterns were a solution to one problem. The rotation grazing was a solution to another. But the Hollow Creek property was still carrying debt from Silas's years of minimal investment. The market price for beef was volatile in a way that depended on factors 3 states away, and their operation was still small enough that one bad season, one disease running through the herd, one catastrophic equipment failure, one sustained dry spell that outlasted even the cistern reserves could unravel everything they'd built. She was thinking about this on the morning walk when she heard a horse coming up the eastern approach. It was Pete Grady, riding in from the direction of Harlan's Crossing, which was odd because Pete didn't have reason to be in town on a weekday morning. He pulled up near the barn and climbed down, and his face had the careful, neutral expression of someone delivering information they've already decided they don't want to be the messenger for. "Morning," Maeve said. "Morning, ma'am?" He held his hat in both hands, turning it. "I was picking up the feed order. Heard something at the supply store I thought you and Colt should know about. Tell me." "Bryce is buying up water rights," Pete said. "Eastern tributary rights, specifically. The ones that feed into the drainage system that runs through this part of the county. He's been quiet about it, doing it through a land agent in Caldwell, so nobody sees his name directly, but the store owner's wife has a cousin who works in the land agent's office, and—" He stopped, as if aware he was getting into the territory of gossip chains. "Point is, it sounds like it's real." Maeve was quiet for a moment. The morning was still cool, the sun still low, the shadows long across the dry yard. "How many rights?" she asked. Couldn't get a precise number, enough that people were talking about it. "Did anyone say which tributaries specifically?" "The Weston branch came up, maybe the Caldwell Fork too." She thanked Pete and told him to get the feed unloaded. Then she went inside and found Colt, who was at the table with coffee and the month's expense ledger, and told him what she'd heard. He listened to the whole thing the way he always did, without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the coffee. "Bryce buying water rights doesn't directly affect us," he said. "Not yet," Maeve said. "Not directly. But if he controls enough of the tributary rights in this county, he controls the baseline water availability for every operation that doesn't have its own secured source. He can't charge us for water we're already collecting, but he can make it considerably harder for any operation that might want to partner with us, work with us, buy from us. He's not necessarily coming at us. He might just be building walls around us." Colt looked at her steadily. "You think this is about us?" "I think Harlan Bryce is a man who moves before he needs to," Maeve said. "I think the cisterns and the rotation results have been noticed by more people than just the ones making jokes about them. And I think a man like Bryce doesn't wait until something is already a threat before he responds to it." The acknowledgement sat between them for a moment. "What do we do?" Colt said. "We find out exactly which rights he's bought and which ones are still available," Maeve said. "And we talk to whoever we can talk to in this county who might have a shared interest in this situation, not going Bryce's way." The next 3 weeks were the most socially demanding of Maeve's life, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that was saying something, because her life had not been socially generous. She and Colt made calls on 6 neighboring properties, not the large operations, most of which were either allied with Bryce or sufficiently intimidated by him to stay clear, but the smaller ones, the family operations that were one bad season from losing everything, the ones who had the most to gain from cooperation and the least capacity to go it alone. The Garner family, 7 miles south, running a modest spread that had survived 2 droughts on stubbornness alone. The widow Abigail Foss, who managed 30-odd cattle on her own since her husband had died 2 winters back, and who had a reputation for fierce independence that had kept most people from offering her help, and all the help that implied about her needing it. The Vasquez brothers, Ernesto and Felipe, whose family had ranched this part of Texas since before the territory was fully settled, and who had more practical knowledge about the land than almost anyone, but less legal documentation than they should have. Each visit required Maeve to do something that did not come naturally to her, which was to walk into someone else's home and ask for trust before she'd had time to earn it. She didn't dress it up as something else. She sat at people's kitchen tables and laid out what she knew about the water rights situation and what she thought it meant and what she was proposing, which was simple: information sharing, informal coordination, no formal partnership that required anyone to sign anything or commit to anything that exposed them. The Garners listened politely and said they needed to think about it, which meant maybe. Abigail Foss asked 3 sharp questions and then said flatly, "What's in it for Mercer specifically?" "The same thing's in it for us as for you," Maeve said. "We're not big enough yet to be Bryce's primary problem. We'd like to stay that way a little longer while we get larger." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. She was a lean woman in her late 40s with eyes that had the particular alertness of someone who'd been making decisions alone long enough that she'd gotten good at spotting when someone was trying to make them for her. "I've heard things about you," Abigail said. "I expect you have," Maeve said. "Most of it wasn't complimentary." "No," Maeve agreed. "It generally hasn't been." "The water cistern business was smart," Abigail said. "This was not offered warmly. It was offered the way a hard woman offers a fact she's already checked twice before saying out loud. The Prewitt fence thing was smart too. I don't generally like clever people. They tend to be clever at your expense eventually." "That's fair," Maeve said. "I can't prove otherwise in advance. All I can tell you is what I'm proposing specifically, which doesn't require you to trust me in any general sense." Abigail was quiet for a while. Then, "What do you need from me right now?" "Information about your water situation and what you know about the local drainage systems. Nothing signed, nothing committed." "That I can do," Abigail said. It was the beginning of something that would later matter considerably, though at the time it looked like two women sitting at a kitchen table talking about water drainage and being careful about how much they admitted to needing each other. The Vasquez brothers were the most useful conversation of the six. Ernesto, the older one, had a detailed working knowledge of the county's water systems that came from 40 years of paying attention to things most people walked past. He knew which tributaries fed which drainage channels. He knew which surface rights were technically separate from which subsurface claims. And he knew from sources he didn't name exactly which rights Bryce had bought, and in what order and through which agent. Maeve sat at their table for 3 hours and wrote down everything Ernesto told her, asking clarifying questions in a way that seemed to genuinely please him because he was a man who knew a great deal that most people hadn't been interested in hearing. When she and Colt drove home that evening, she had 6 pages of notes in the brown notebook and a clearer picture of the situation than she'd had that morning. "He's not trying to cut us off," she said, organizing her thinking out loud. "Not directly. What he's buying creates leverage over the Eastern County generally. It's broader than us. But it means if we ever want to expand our grazing into the eastern parcels, we'd be dependent on rights he controls." "So the expansion plan we talked about for next year gets more complicated," Maeve said. "Not impossible, but we need to move faster than we planned, and we need to be smarter about which direction we expand." Colt drove without speaking for a while. The road back to Hollow Creek was rough in the dark, the horses knowing it better than the ruts they could see. "When did you start thinking about the expansion?" he asked eventually. "Since August," Maeve said, "when the summer herd numbers came in better than projected. We have more capacity than we're using, but I didn't want to bring it up until I knew whether the water position was secure enough to support it." "Is it?" "It will be," she said, "if we move right." They moved right, though right in this context meant a series of decisions over the following months that looked, from the outside, either methodical or stubborn, depending on which neighbor you asked. The rotation system expanded. Maeve had spent the summer refining it, not the original plan, which had been solid, but the details within it, the timing adjustments and the section length calculations, and the question of how many animals a section could sustainably carry without degrading the grass recovery. She'd been wrong about 2 of her initial estimates and corrected them without particular drama, which was an approach Colt had noticed and appreciated because he'd worked with men who treated being wrong as a catastrophe requiring extensive defense, and he found it exhausting. "You fixed the east section timing," he said one morning, looking at the updated schedule she'd put on the barn wall. "The recovery rate was slower than I projected," Maeve said. "The soil there is harder. I was working from a general estimate, and the actual data came back different, so I adjusted. Just like that." "What would you have me do instead?" she asked, without irritation, genuinely curious. He thought about it. "Nothing," he said. He stopped. "It's efficient is all." "Being wrong is only a problem if you refuse to fix it," Maeve said, and went back to what she was doing. The breeding decisions that fall were the ones that generated the most conversation in Harlan's Crossing, primarily because they were visible in the way that accounting decisions weren't. Maeve had been reading about cattle breeds adapted to dry conditions, breeds that weren't commonly used in this part of Texas, that required less water per pound of body weight and maintained condition through lean seasons better than the standard stock most ranchers ran. Getting access to bulls from these lines required correspondence and patience and one trip to a livestock sale in a county to the south, where Colt stood in a crowd of ranchers and bought two animals that several of the other buyers looked at with open skepticism. "Those are small," one man said, beside Colt at the rail, watching the animals being moved. "For now," Colt said. "What's the plan? Cross them into your herd?" "That's the idea." The man looked like he wanted to say more, but something in Colt's tone, not unfriendly, just final, suggested that the conversation had reached its natural end, and he let it go. Back in Harlan's Crossing, the story of Mercer buying unusual bulls at a southern sale reached Deke Pruitt within 4 days. Pruitt told Bryce. Bryce said, over a card table, that Mercer was throwing money at experiments instead of fundamentals, and would have the results he deserved by spring. By spring, the first crossbred calves were born healthy and strong-limbed in a dry season that killed cattle on 3 neighboring operations, and Bryce did not say anything about it publicly, which was its own kind of comment. The trouble with the well happened in February, and it was the kind of trouble that made everything else look manageable by comparison. Maeve woke early on a Tuesday morning to find Amos standing in the yard looking at the main well with an expression she'd never seen on him before, which was essentially no expression at all. The particular blankness of a man who has found something bad and hasn't decided how to feel about it yet. The well water was wrong. Not obviously, not at a glance, but wrong in the way Amos had detected because he paid attention to things. A faint off color, a smell that was just barely there if you put your face close. He'd noticed it when he drew water for the morning stock. "Don't use it," Maeve said immediately. "Not for the animals, not for anything until we know what it is." She spent that morning at the well, taking samples into small jars she found in the kitchen, comparing color, smell, consistency. She wasn't a chemist, and she knew it, but she'd read enough about common well contamination in ranch country to have a working theory within 2 hours. Colt came back from the east section where he'd been working with the Crane brothers and found her sitting on the well surround with 4 jars lined up and the brown notebook open. "What happened?" "I think someone put something in it," Maeve said. The silence that followed was a different kind than their usual silences. "You're sure it's not natural," he said. "I'm not sure of anything until I can get these samples to someone who can analyze them. But the pattern is wrong for a natural contamination event. The main cistern is fine, I checked. The secondary well on the north side is fine. It's only this one, which is the one visible from the eastern property line." Colt's face had gone very still. Pruitt sighed. "I'm not making accusations I can't document," Maeve said. "I'm telling you what I see and what it suggests." She picked up one of the jars and looked at it in the morning light. "We'll use the cistern water for the animals until this is resolved. We have enough. It's inconvenient, not catastrophic." "That may be the point," Colt said. "Inconvenience us enough, add to the cost and the labor, see if we crack." "Then we don't crack," Maeve said. "And we document everything, and we get the samples analyzed, and we build the record, same as the fence line." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not angry." "I'm extremely angry," Maeve said. "I'm just not doing it out loud right now." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the internal equivalent of one. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" The samples went to Caldwell with Colt on Thursday. He came back with a name from the county health registrar, a man in the city who did water analysis, and the results came back 10 days later. Sulfur compounds and a trace of something the analyst couldn't fully identify, but noted was not naturally occurring in the soil composition of this part of the county. They filed it. County Health Office, County Sheriff's records, Maeve's own detailed documentation with dates and observations. Pruitt was never formally charged with anything, because proving who had done it was a different problem than proving something had been done. But the record existed, and records had a way of accumulating weight over time. The well was cleared, and the casing sealed better than it had been before. The total cost was significant, but not ruinous. They absorbed it and kept moving. 3 weeks later, the Garner family sent word that they'd like to have that follow-up conversation Maeve had suggested in the fall. Abigail Foss had apparently been talking to them. The word Abigail had apparently used, according to the message from the Garners, was reliable. From Abigail Foss, Maeve understood, that was the equivalent of a formal endorsement. Spring came earlier than expected, and with it, a shift that Maeve had been watching for but hadn't known how to predict. Other workers started coming, not in a flood. Nothing about this operation moved in floods. It moved in the careful, incremental way of a thing that was being built rather than launched. But there was a steady trickle of men and occasionally women who arrived at the Hollow Creek gate asking about work. And they were coming because they'd heard things, and the things they'd heard were specific, that the pay was real, that the decisions made sense, and that the woman who ran the operation treated her workers like people rather than equipment. Maeve interviewed each one herself. This was not standard. On most operations, the foreman handled hiring, and the rancher's wife was not part of the process, and several of the men who arrived had to visibly adjust their expectations when they found themselves sitting across a kitchen table from her answering questions about their work history and their specific skills and what they were looking for. One man, a big, wary fellow named Dale, who'd ridden in from east of Caldwell, sat down and looked at her and then looked around the kitchen as if waiting for someone else to arrive and take over. "Something wrong?" Maeve asked. "No, ma'am," Dale said. "Just didn't expect—" He stopped. "Didn't expect me," she said. "Didn't expect to be interviewed by the rancher's wife specifically?" "No, ma'am." "I'm not interviewing you as the rancher's wife," Maeve said. "I'm interviewing you as the person who manages this operation's day-to-day decisions, which is what I am, whatever title you want to put on it. Is that a problem?" Dale thought about this. He was a man who looked like he thought slowly, but the thinking was generally thorough. "No," he said finally. "I guess not. What do you want to know?" She hired him. He was one of the best workers they'd find in the next 2 years. Methodical, capable of following complex instructions without needing them simplified, and possessed of a natural authority among the other hands that proved useful when Colt was away, and Maeve needed someone the men would take direction from without having to think too hard about it. She noticed that about her own situation, in the clear-eyed way she tried to notice uncomfortable facts. Some of the men followed her direction without problem. A few needed to see Colt affirm her authority before they fully committed to it. She adapted to this not with resentment, but with the practical recognition that she was operating in conditions that existed regardless of her opinion of them, and that being effective within those conditions was more valuable than being right about them. What she didn't adapt to was being dismissed entirely, and she didn't encounter that often. Once or twice with hired men who were let go quickly for reasons that had nothing to do specifically with her and everything to do with their general approach to following any direction from anyone. And what Colt said each time, in those situations, was short and clear. "This ranch runs the way my wife runs it, and if that's a problem for you, it's a problem that's easy to solve." He said it without heat. That was the thing she kept noting, privately. He said it as a fact rather than a defense, which made it considerably harder to argue with. By summer's end, the second summer, the one that was supposed to prove the first had been a fluke, the Hollow Creek operation was running 41 head of cattle, had a crew of 11 workers, had 3 fully functional cisterns, and 2 additional secondary water collection points built over the spring, and had turned a modest but real profit for the first time in the property's recent history. Maeve sat with the account books on the last evening of August and ran the numbers twice because she'd trained herself not to trust a result she wanted until she'd confirmed it. The numbers were the same both times. She sat with that for a while, not celebrating. She was not a woman who celebrated easily, and the profit was modest, and there were debts still to address and risks still in play, and a situation with Bryce that hadn't resolved, merely paused. But there was something in the room with her that she didn't try to name or contain. A quiet acknowledgement, internal and private, that what they had been told was impossible had turned out, through a great deal of specific and difficult and unglamorous work, to not be. Colt came in from the barn late and found her at the table and looked at her face and said, "Good news?" "We made money," Maeve said. He was quiet. He went to the shelf and poured 2 small glasses of whiskey. They kept 1 bottle for occasions, though neither of them drank habitually, and set one in front of her and sat down across the table. "How much?" he asked. She told him. He looked at the glass in his hand, then at her. You know what Bryce said at the beginning of the year? That we'd fold before spring, Maeve said. That exactly. She picked up her glass. The whiskey was rough. It always was at the price point they bought at. But it was real, and the evening was real. And outside the window, the dry pasture had gotten less dry over 2 seasons of careful management and was, by some measures that only Maeve had been tracking closely, beginning to show signs of genuine recovery. Bryce is going to be a problem, she said. Not a finished problem. He's going to come at us again. I know, Colt said. I want you to know I know, she said. She gestured at the account books, the numbers, the proof of the thing they'd built. Doesn't mean we're safe. It means we've survived long enough to become worth attacking seriously. Colt looked at her for a moment. In the lamplight, his face had the particular expression she'd come to associate with him at his most direct, open, without performance, just a man saying what he actually thought. I know that too, he said. But right now it's the end of August and we made money. Can we have 10 minutes where that's the only thing that's true? Maeve considered this. Then she picked up her glass. 10 minutes, she said. Outside, the night was coming down over Hollow Creek the way it always did. Without ceremony, without announcement, just the gradual withdrawal of light and the appearance of stars above a piece of land that was, slowly and stubbornly, and against the confident predictions of almost everyone who had ever looked at it, becoming something. The 10 minutes Colt had asked for stretched into the fall, which was the longest either of them let themselves rest. By October, the information coming in from the Vasquez brothers, and from Abigail Foss, and from Pete Grady's quiet ears in Harlan's Crossing, had begun forming a pattern that Maeve recognized the way she recognized bad soil. Not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of small ones, each individually explainable, collectively undeniable. Harlan Bryce was meeting with people. Not publicly, not in the saloon where his usual pronouncements got made over card games, but in the back rooms of the land agent's office in Caldwell, and reportedly at his main house on evenings when the lamps burned late. The men he was meeting with included Deke Pruitt, which was expected, and 2 other cattle barons from the northern part of the county, a man named Galt, who controlled the largest feedlot operation in the region and spoke very little in public, and a man named Cosgrove, who had a reputation for knowing exactly which county officials needed what kind of encouragement to see things a particular way. Maeve laid this out for Colt on a cold November morning at the kitchen table, the account books pushed aside to make room for the notes she'd assembled over several weeks. She'd developed a habit of organizing what she knew spatially, names connected to names, events connected to dates, the shape of a thing emerging from the placement of its parts. Bryce alone I can manage, she said. Bryce with Pruitt is harder, but still manageable. Bryce with Galt and Cosgrove. She stopped. What? Colt said. It means he's not trying to inconvenience us, Maeve said. He's trying to end us. The scale of what he's assembling doesn't make sense for anything less. Colt sat with that for a moment. He was wearing his work coat at the table, which meant he'd come in from the morning chores without stopping, and there was mud on his boots that he'd tracked across the floor without noticing, which Maeve noted and let go because some things were not the priority. When? He asked. I don't know, she said. Before spring, I'd guess. He won't want to wait through another season and let us get stronger. What do we do? It was the same question he'd been asking her since the fence line, since the well, since the water rights situation first surfaced, not because he lacked the capacity for strategy, but because he'd arrived, through honest assessment of their respective strengths, at an understanding of who in this partnership thought in the particular way this kind of problem required. He was not the kind of man who found that diminishing. It was one of the things about him that Maeve had come to regard as genuinely unusual. We get stronger faster than he expects, she said. We finish the North Pasture expansion before winter, so we have the additional grazing capacity ready in spring. We get the documentation on the breeding program organized formally in case anyone challenges the herd valuation. And, she paused, I want to talk to the Vasquez brothers about the eastern parcel access. If we can get an informal grazing agreement in place before Bryce makes his move, we have a buffer he doesn't know about. Ernesto won't sign anything formal, Colt said. I'm not asking for formal, Maeve said. I'm asking for real. Those are different things, and Ernesto Vasquez understands the difference better than most. Colt nodded. He stood up and looked at the mud on the floor that he'd tracked in and said, "Sorry about that." "It'll clean," Maeve said. He looked at her, something moving briefly in his expression that wasn't quite readable, and went back out to the yard. The first coordinated attack came in December, and it didn't look like an attack at first. It looked like a business transaction. A man arrived at the Hollow Creek gate on a Wednesday afternoon, well-dressed for the territory, riding a good horse, carrying the particular manner of someone who has been sent by someone else and knows it. He introduced himself as a representative of a land acquisition company based in San Antonio and said he was authorized to make an offer on the Hollow Creek property. Maeve received him at the door because Colt was in the north pasture with the Crane brothers and wasn't expected back for 2 hours. She invited him in, gave him coffee, and listened to the offer with a completely neutral expression that the man clearly found more difficult to read than he'd expected. The offer was insultingly low, not accidentally low the way an opening bid sometimes was, strategically low, designed to communicate something, designed to say, "We know your position is weak, and we know you know it." "Who is the acquisition company representing?" Maeve asked. The man smiled in the way that men smile when they've been specifically told not to answer a question. "The company represents a consortium of investors interested in—" "I heard you the first time," Maeve said. "I'm asking who is behind the company, the beneficial owner." "That information is confidential to the offer is declined," Maeve said. The man blinked. He'd clearly expected a longer conversation. "Mrs. Mercer, I'd encourage you to consider—" "The offer is declined," she said again, with exactly the same tone, which was pleasant and final in the way of a door that has been gently but completely closed. "Thank you for the coffee." When Colt came back, she told him. He listened. Then he said, "Bryce." "Almost certainly," Maeve said. "The timing, the price, it's not about buying the property. It's about seeing if we're scared enough to take what we're offered." "We're not." "No," Maeve said. "We're not." But she sat up late that night after Colt had gone to bed, and she did not spend the time feeling confident. She spent it thinking through every vulnerability she could identify in their position, writing them in the notebook in a column, and then across from each one writing what, if anything, could be done about it. This was a habit she had developed, not to catastrophize, but to map, because the things that destroyed operations were never the ones you'd thought about and addressed. They were the ones you'd assumed were manageable and hadn't looked at directly. The list was longer than she wanted it to be. January brought cold and 3 significant events in rapid succession. The first was a cattle raid. 7 head gone from the southern section on a night when the cloud cover was heavy and the visibility was poor. Not a random act of rustling, but a targeted removal of 7 of their best breeding stock, including 2 of the crossbred animals that represented months of investment and a significant portion of next year's planned expansion. Amos discovered it at first light and came to the house with the same blank expression he'd worn the morning of the well incident. Colt's reaction was not loud, but there was something in it that Maeve had not seen before. A cold, concentrated anger that he carried through the day in the set of his shoulders, and the brevity of his words, and the way he looked at the southern fence line when they rode out to assess it. The fence had been cut cleanly, professional work, not casual. They reported it to the sheriff, who was a man named Callahan, not the corrupt Cosgrove-adjacent official that operated in Caldwell, but the local county sheriff, who was honest in the limited way that some men were honest when honesty was easy, and the political winds hadn't yet required otherwise. He took the report, examined the fence cut, made appropriate noises, and found nothing. The second event was the supply line problem. The feed merchant in Harlan's Crossing, a man named Whitfield who had been supplying Hollow Creek since the beginning and had been reliable, if not warm, sent word that he was unable to fulfill their next order. No explanation given. 3 days later, the lumber merchant sent a similar message. 2 weeks after that, the man who had been providing them with equipment repair services in Caldwell sent a letter saying he was taking on no new work. 1 cancellation was a business decision. 3 was a pattern. "Cosgrove," Maeve said when she'd assembled the information. "You think he got to the merchants," Colt said. "I think someone made it more profitable for them to decline our business than to take it," Maeve said. Cosgrove has the county connections and the money to do it. Bryce has the motive. The combination is straightforward. They adapted. Maeve spent 3 days writing letters and sending Pete Grady on a series of rides to establish alternative supply relationships. Merchants in farther towns who hadn't been reached yet. A feed operation run by a family in the southern county that Ernesto Vasquez had mentioned in passing and turned out to be both reliable and glad for the business. It cost more and required more logistics. They absorbed it. The third event was the one that hit differently. Word came through Abigail Foss that the county land office in Caldwell had received a formal challenge to the original survey documentation on the Hollow Creek eastern boundary, the same boundary where Prewitt had moved the fence markers a year and a half earlier. The challenge was filed by a land attorney from San Antonio whose name no one in the county recognized, which meant he had been brought in specifically. The challenge claimed irregularities in the original survey that had established the eastern property line. Maeve read the notification twice. Then she put it flat on the table and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. "They're going after the land itself," she said. Colt was standing across the room. His face had the look it got when something had crossed a line he'd been privately marking for some time. "If the boundary challenge stands, it won't stand," Maeve said. "The documentation we filed after the fence incident, the original survey copy, the county registration records, it's all there. But this is expensive to fight. That's the point. They're not necessarily expecting to win the challenge. They're expecting to cost us money we may not have while simultaneously raiding our cattle and cutting off our supply lines." "Death by 1,000 cuts," Colt said. "Yes," Maeve said, "and while we're bleeding from 1,000 places, we're distracted and the operation suffers, and the numbers stop working, and eventually we take whatever offer they put in front of us just to stop the hemorrhaging." She looked at him directly. "This is what a coordinated campaign looks like. This is all of them, moving together on a timeline." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the January wind was moving across the pasture in a way that had no particular drama to it, just cold air doing what cold air does. "So what do we do?" Colt asked. "We do several things at once," Maeve said, "and none of them are simple." The meeting at Abigail Foss's kitchen table happened on a Saturday in late January, and it was the most crowded gathering any of those present had attended in recent memory. Maeve had sent word to everyone she'd been building relationships with: the Garner family, the Vasquez brothers, Abigail herself, and 2 other small operators she'd spoken to more recently, a man named Birch, who ran cattle east of the Vasquez property, and a young widow named Sarah Dunmore, who had inherited 20 acres and 8 head from her father and had been managing them alone for a year with a competence that most people in the county hadn't yet noticed. 8 adults around Abigail's table, which was designed for 5. Colt was there, but he sat at the edge and let Maeve run it, which she did without preamble. "You've all been feeling pressure," she said. "Some of you have had supply problems. Some of you have had equipment issues or labor problems that seemed unrelated. I want to tell you that I believe they're related, and I want to tell you what I think is actually happening." She laid it out. Not everything. Some of what she knew was still provisional, and she wasn't going to present guesswork as fact to people who needed to make real decisions based on what she said. But the shape of it, the coordinated campaign against Hollow Creek as the most visible target, the water rights consolidation that affected everyone at the table, the supply line manipulation, and the land challenge. When she finished, there was a silence that had different qualities from different people. The Garner husband looked frightened, which was honest. His wife looked angry, which was more useful. Ernesto Vasquez looked unsurprised, which meant he'd already seen this coming and had been waiting to see whether anyone would say it out loud. Abigail Foss said, "What do you want from us?" "Information sharing," Maeve said. "Coordinated timing on things like supply orders so that if one of us gets cut off, others can redistribute. And I want to formalize the documentation across all our properties. Survey records, boundary documentation, water rights, everything that a well-funded legal challenge might go after. If our records are solid and consistent and cross-referenced, it's harder to attack one without exposing the attack on all." "You want us to act as a unit," Birch said. He was a careful man who chose his words deliberately. "I want us to protect each other without exposing each other," Maeve said. There's a difference. I'm not asking anyone to take on Bryce directly. I'm asking everyone to make themselves harder to pick off one at a time. The Garner wife, her name was Ruth, and she had the kind of face that didn't do much and meant everything, said, "What's your land challenge going to cost you?" "I don't know yet," Maeve said honestly. "I'm going to Caldwell next week to find a land attorney. It won't be small." "Can you afford it?" "We'll manage," Maeve said. "We've been managing things we couldn't afford since we got here." Ruth Garner looked at her husband. Something passed between them, the compressed communication of two people who've been married long enough to have an actual language. Then Ruth said, "We'll join the documentation effort, and if your supply situation gets critical, we have a cousin in Waco who runs a feed operation." "Thank you," Maeve said. What she didn't say was how much the simple offer cost her to receive, not because she was ungrateful, but because accepting help had never come easily, and being in a position where she needed it felt, still, like a kind of exposure she hadn't fully made peace with. She filed that feeling away and dealt with the practical matter in front of her, which was what she generally did with feelings that didn't have an immediate solution. February was the worst month. The cattle raid that had taken 7 head in January was followed by a second, smaller one in early February. 3 animals gone from the north section, fence cut in a different location, different night. The sheriff came out again and found nothing again. Colt said very little about it during the day, and at night Maeve could hear him awake in his room, which she'd never noticed before. She knocked on his door one night at 11 o'clock, which she'd never done before either. He answered it quickly, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. "The East Supply route from the Waco contact is confirmed," she said, which was true, but also not the reason she'd knocked. "The first delivery comes Thursday." Colt leaned against the doorframe. He looked tired in a specific way. Not physical tired, which was his baseline and didn't show on him particularly, but something else. Something that came from being targeted repeatedly by people you couldn't confront directly. "We're going to get the cattle back," he said. It was not a confident statement. It was a man saying something to see if he believed it. "We're going to build a herd that makes those 10 animals not matter," Maeve said. "In 2 years, we won't remember the number." He looked at her for a moment. "Do you actually believe that?" "I believe we've been right more times than we've been wrong," she said. "I believe the people doing this to us are spending money and effort, and they wouldn't be doing that if we weren't worth the trouble." She paused. "I also believe it's going to get worse before it gets better. I won't tell you otherwise." "No," he said. "You never do." There was something in the way he said it. Not criticism, nothing close to criticism. More like the way you acknowledge a quality in someone that you've come to depend on without quite having named it before. "Get some sleep," Maeve said. "You too," he said. She went back to her room and did not in fact get much sleep, but that was a separate matter. The situation broke open in March, not through any elegant strategic maneuver, but through the specific chaos of a night when everything happened at once. Colt had gone to Caldwell 3 days earlier for a meeting with the land attorney handling the boundary challenge, a man named Archibald Crane, no relation to the brothers on the crew, who was thorough and expensive and had said in their first meeting that the documentation Maeve had assembled over the previous year and a half was, in his words, unusually solid, which was the most enthusiasm Maeve suspected he expressed about anything. The meeting had run long, and then a problem with the road south of Caldwell, a washed-out section from recent rain, had kept Colt from returning on schedule. He sent word with a rider that he'd be back by morning. The attack came at midnight. Maeve was woken by Amos, who had been sleeping light since the second cattle raid and had heard movement on the southern approach. Not 1 or 2 men this time, but enough boots and horses that the sound of it was distinct from natural night noise. He woke her without light, speaking quietly at her door. She was dressed and moving in 3 minutes. What happened next was not a battle in any cinematic sense. It was confused and dark and cold, and required a series of rapid decisions made with incomplete information, which was the actual texture of almost every crisis Maeve had ever been in, and nothing at all like the stories people told about them afterward. She gathered who she had: Amos, the Crane brothers, Dale, Hector, Sim, and Pete Grady, who had started sleeping at the bunkhouse 2 nights a week since the second raid because his instincts had told him something was building. 8 people, 4 of whom she knew were genuinely steady under pressure, and the other 4 she was less certain about. She had thought about this possibility. Not this exact night, not these exact circumstances, but the possibility of a coordinated physical attack on the property when Colt was away, because that was the obvious play. Remove the visible head of the operation and test whether what remained could hold. She had walked the property enough times, in all conditions and all lights, to know where its defensive positions were. She knew where the visibility was longest and where it compressed. She knew which approaches required crossing open ground and which ones moved through cover. She assigned positions quickly, without ceremony, told each person where to go and why in 2 sentences or fewer, which left no room for debate because there wasn't time for it. "Don't fire first," she said before they separated. "Make noise. Show the numbers we have. If they're testing us, I want them to test a problem, not an opportunity." "And if they don't back off?" Ellis Crane asked. "Then we protect what's ours," Maeve said, "but make the first choice theirs." What the men coming in from the south encountered when they crossed the property line in the dark was not an empty ranch with a woman alone in the house. They encountered 6 visible positions, more light than they'd expected from the lanterns positioned at Maeve's direction to maximize visible coverage, and a level of organized resistance that communicated, without anyone having to say it directly, that whoever had given them this assignment had badly misjudged the situation. They withdrew before full contact was made. 2 of the attackers were identified by Dale, who had good eyes and better memory and had seen them before in the context of Prewitt's operation. He told Maeve this in a low voice while the property was still being secured, and she wrote it down in the brown notebook by lamplight, with hands that she noticed, with some interest, were not entirely steady. She let them shake. Then she kept writing. Colt arrived at dawn, coming up the road with the particular urgency of a man who had gotten partial information while still traveling and had covered the last miles accordingly. He pulled up in the yard and took in Maeve's face and the positions of the men and the state of the property in one fast assessment. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She told him. All of it in order, while he stood beside his horse in the early morning cold with his jaw tight and his eyes moving over the property the whole time she talked, checking it the way a man checks something he almost lost. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Anyone hurt?" he said. "No." "The herd?" "Intact. Amos has the full count." He stood there in the cold, and something moved through his expression that she didn't try to name because it was private and complicated, and she respected that in him. Then he looked at her directly, and he said, "You held it." "We held it," Maeve said. "Your crew held it." "My crew did what you told them to do," Colt said. "Don't minimize that." She didn't have an answer for that, which was unusual. She looked away across the pasture where the morning was coming in pale and cold over the land they had spent 2 years making survivable. The documentation from that night, the identification of the 2 men by Dale, the physical evidence of the incursion, the timing, the coordination with the attempted supply cuts and the cattle raids and the land challenge, went to Archibald Crane in Caldwell within 4 days. Crane looked at it, looked at everything else Maeve had assembled across the previous year and a half, and said, in the quiet way of a man who has just seen something that changes the shape of a legal situation, "This isn't just a property dispute anymore." "No," Maeve said, "it isn't. This is a conspiracy to defraud and intimidate multiple landowners," Crane said. "If I can take this to the right level of the county judiciary—" "Can you?" Maeve asked. "With this documentation?" He looked at her over the papers spread across his desk. "Mrs. Mercer, where did you learn to keep records like this?" "I had good reason to," Maeve said. Crane arranged a meeting with the county court judge the following week. Not Cosgrove's judges. Crane was careful about which courtroom this went to, which was its own kind of navigation through the county's politics that Maeve let him handle because it was his territory, and she was not too proud to acknowledge the limits of hers. The process that followed was not fast. Nothing in the county legal system was fast, but it was moving, and it was moving in the direction of accountability, and the documentation that Maeve had built over 2 years of patient-specific, unglamorous record-keeping was, piece by piece, becoming the foundation of something that Harlan Bryce and his partners had never anticipated when they'd looked at Hollow Creek and seen a soft target. They had seen a woman who read books and had unconventional ideas and made a large man look foolish by being his wife. They had not seen the notebook. They had not seen the cistern maps or the fence line records or the well contamination samples or the supply chain documentation or the account books that showed, season by season, an operation growing with the specific, sustainable logic of something that had been thought through rather than rushed. They had not understood that everything they'd done to the Hollow Creek operation had been recorded, dated, cross-referenced, and filed somewhere that Cosgrove's reach did not extend. That was their fundamental miscalculation, and it was Maeve Holloway's advantage, and she had been building it since the day she'd bought the first brown notebook from the general store in Harlan's Crossing while the shopkeeper's wife watched her in silence. She had known, even then, that it would matter eventually. She just hadn't known yet how completely. The county courthouse in Caldwell was not an impressive building. It had the look of something that had been built quickly by people who expected to replace it eventually and then never gotten around to it. 2 stories of pale limestone with windows that didn't quite sit level and a front door that stuck in humid weather. Maeve had been inside it 3 times before the hearing, each time with Archibald Crane, learning the layout of the place the way she learned every place she needed to operate in, not with sentiment, but with attention. The hearing was set for the second week of April, which gave Crane 6 weeks from the night of the incursion to assemble the formal presentation. He used the time with the focused efficiency of a man who had been practicing law in difficult territory long enough to understand that preparation was the only thing that reliably worked. He was not a dramatic man in the courtroom sense. He didn't perform, didn't project more confidence than the evidence warranted, and had told Maeve at their second meeting that juries and judges both could smell exaggeration and that the cleanest arguments were almost always the strongest ones. The documentation Maeve had assembled gave him an unusually clean argument. She sat in Crane's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, while he walked through the structure of what he was presenting to the court, and she followed it with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered considerably. The boundary fraud, documented through the original survey, the fence marker incident, the county notification records, all of it cross-dated and internally consistent. The well contamination, the analysis results, the timing relative to the fence dispute, the physical evidence of tampering, the cattle raids, Dale's identification of the 2 men, the pattern of targeting, the correlation with the removal of Colt from the property, the supply line interference, the merchant cancellations, their timing, the subsequent discovery through the Waco contact that at least one of the merchants had been explicitly offered financial inducement to decline Hollow Creek's business, something Maeve had quietly confirmed through a conversation Ruth Garner had facilitated with the feed merchant's former employee. The land challenge, the San Antonio attorney, his known associations, the legal filings timing relative to the physical attack. The conspiracy argument rests on demonstrating coordinated intent, Crane said. Individually, several of these incidents are arguable as coincidence or legitimate business competition. Together, and on this timeline, he spread the documents across the desk in the sequence Maeve had originally organized them. The only reasonable interpretation is coordination. Will the judge see it that way? Maeve asked. Judge Harmon is not a man who appreciates people who abuse legal processes to do what they're afraid to do openly, Crane said. The land challenge, specifically, is going to irritate him. He'll see it for what it is. And Cosgrove's influence? Crane looked at her. I chose Judge Harmon's courtroom specifically because Cosgrove's influence stops 2 steps short of him. I've been practicing in this county for 19 years, Mrs. Mercer. I know where the walls are. She accepted this. Not because she trusted blindly. She didn't. But because Crane had proven himself specific in exactly the ways that mattered, and she had come to distinguish, through considerable experience, between competence performing confidence and competence simply being competent. What do you need from me at the hearing? She asked. You'll be called to authenticate the documentation, Crane said. The record-keeping system, how you assembled it, the dates, your direct observations. You'll need to be clear and literal. Don't elaborate beyond the question. Don't explain yourself preemptively. He paused. Can you do that? I've been doing that for 2 years, Maeve said. Colt drove them to Caldwell the morning of the hearing, and they made most of the trip in the silence that had become, over 2 years, their natural mode of traveling together. It was an uncomfortable silence. It never really had been. even in the early months when they'd still been calibrating how much space each of them needed. It was the silence of two people who had run out of small talk early and found, without making a decision about it, that they preferred the real thing. About 6 miles out from Caldwell, Colt said, "Whatever happens today, don't," Maeve said. He glanced at her. "Don't tell me it'll be all right regardless," she said. "I know you mean it kindly, but I need today to matter, and it'll matter less if we've already decided it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was going to say whatever happens today, the work we've done is real. The ranch is real. Nobody can argue that away in a courtroom." Maeve looked at him. "Oh," she said. "Yeah," he said. She faced forward again. The road into Caldwell was better than the Hollow Creek Road, maintained more regularly, wider through the middle section, and the horses moved at a steady pace that put them at the courthouse with 40 minutes before the hearing began. They were not the only ones who arrived. The Vasquez brothers came, Ernesto driving the wagon with Felipe beside him, and both of them in their good clothes, which Maeve noted and felt something about that she didn't examine too closely. The Garners came, both of them, Ruth with her good hat on. Abigail Foss came alone on her own horse, tying it at the rail with the efficiency of a woman who did everything alone and had made her peace with it. Birch came. Sarah Dunmore came, which surprised Maeve because Sarah had the most to lose from being publicly associated with an action against Bryce and had the least legal protection if things went wrong. Maeve went to her in the courthouse yard before they went inside. "You don't have to be here," she said. Sarah Dunmore was 26 years old and had her father's blunt jaw and her own particular variety of determination that she hadn't yet had enough time to fully identify in herself. "I have water rights that Bryce has been edging toward for 4 months," she said. "I'm here for my own reasons, not yours." "Fair enough," Maeve said. Inside the courtroom, the opposition was present in the form of the San Antonio attorney, a man named Hewitt, whose suit cost more than most people in that room made in 2 months, flanked by a local legal representative, and, in the gallery, Deke Pruitt, and a man Crane had identified as Galt's business manager. Bryce himself was not present. Cosgrove was not present. The people who made the decisions were not in the room where those decisions would be examined, which was also a kind of documentation. Colt sat in the gallery beside Ernesto Vasquez and didn't take his eyes off Maeve from the moment she walked to the witness table. She was on the stand for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Hewitt was skilled in the way that expensive attorneys are skilled, not always in the truth of what they argued, but in the architecture of doubt, the placement of questions designed to make clear things seem murky, and murky things seem definitive. He went after the documentation methodology first, suggesting that the organization of records was itself evidence of premeditation rather than contemporaneous observation. Maeve explained precisely and without heat how the brown notebook had been started in the first week at the property because she'd been trained in survey work, and survey work required field documentation, and she hadn't seen a reason to stop doing what she'd always done. "Always?" Hewitt said, with the specific inflection of a man finding a thread to pull. "Since I was 19 years old and working for a county surveying company," Maeve said. "I have documentation from that period that predates my marriage to Mr. Mercer by 8 years if it would be useful to the court." Crane did not smile, but there was something in the angle of his head that suggested he might have, in private. Hewitt moved to the well contamination. He challenged the chain of evidence on the samples, suggesting that the gap between Maeve's collection of the samples and their delivery to the analyst in Caldwell introduced reasonable doubt about their integrity. Maeve walked through the handling procedures she'd used, the sealed jars, the labeling, the direct delivery by Colt without intermediate handling. And then she said evenly that if the defense wished to challenge the analyst's methodology, the analyst was available to testify, and she expected he'd be able to speak to his own professional standards more authoritatively than she could. The analyst was subsequently called. He was thorough, technical, and largely immune to Hewitt's methods because he spoke in the specific, inarguable language of chemistry and had been doing so for 20 years. The identification of the two raiders by Dale was challenged on the grounds that the identification had been made at night at distance and was therefore unreliable. Dale, called to testify, described the distance, the available light from the lanterns Maeve had positioned, and the specific identifying features he'd recognized from prior encounters with both men at Prewitt's operation. He spoke without embellishment, and with the particular credibility of a man who understood that being wrong about something like this would be worse than saying he wasn't sure. He was sure. He said so simply, and the simplicity of it was harder to argue with than any elaborate account would have been. It was the supply line evidence that shifted something in the courtroom, the testimony from the Waco Contact's former employee, brought in by Crane, who had direct knowledge of the financial inducement offered to the Harlan's Crossing feed merchant. Hewitt objected to the testimony twice on procedural grounds, and was overruled both times by Judge Harmon, who had the expression of a man who had been watching a pattern form for 3 hours and was now watching it complete itself. When Maeve was finally released from the stand, her back ached from holding it straight for nearly 4 hours, and her hands were cold despite the warmth in the room. She sat beside Crane and he said very quietly, "Good." And she understood that from him, this was the equivalent of an extended celebration. The hearing recessed on the first day without a ruling, which Crane had expected. Judge Harmon was not a man who ruled quickly on complicated matters, and the coordination of the conspiracy argument required him to consider the relationship between what was provable directly and what was provable inferentially. He called for written briefs from both sides within 2 weeks and set the ruling date for early May. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of the entire 2.5 years. Not harder than what had come before, but suspended in a particular way that Maeve found more difficult than active difficulty. She could work through a problem. She found it harder to wait for someone else to decide. She kept working. The spring planning of the grazing rotation went in. The eastern pasture expansion, which had been delayed by the winter's disruptions, finally got its boundary fencing completed with the Crane brothers handling the majority of the physical work and Hector supervising with the steady competence that had made him one of the most valuable people on the property. The new calves from the crossbred herd, 17 of them through the spring, born healthy and strong, exactly the results the breeding program had been designed to produce, required the particular daily attention of the early weeks, and Amos managed it with the quiet expertise that had been one of the genuine surprises of the operation. Amos found her in the barn one evening in late April, checking on a calf that had been born slightly early and needed monitoring. He came and stood by the stall without urgency, which meant he had something to say that wasn't an emergency. "I've been thinking," he said. Maeve waited. "When I came here, I didn't expect to stay," Amos said. "I've said that before. I want to say something else now." He was looking at the calf, not at her. "What you did? The way you ran the place? The rotation? The breeding decisions? The way you handled the attack and the legal business? I've worked cattle for 22 years. I've worked for people who knew what they were doing and people who didn't. I want you to know I see the difference." Maeve looked at him. He was a man who almost never said things that required a response, so she understood that this one did. "Thank you, Amos," she said. "I'm not saying it to be kind," he said, with a touch of his characteristic directness. "I'm saying it because it's accurate." "I know," she said. "That's why it means something." He nodded once and went back to the barn work, and Maeve stayed with the calf a little longer than strictly necessary. The ruling came on the 7th of May, which was a Thursday, and Crane sent a rider with the news because Maeve had told him she didn't want to wait for the mail. The rider arrived at midday while Maeve was in the north pasture with Pete Grady, working through a section of the rotation schedule that needed adjusting based on the spring grass recovery rates. She saw him coming up the road at a pace that suggested he'd been told to move quickly, and she felt something in her chest that she chose not to name. She walked to the gate and read the letter standing there, Pete Grady waiting a respectful distance away. The boundary challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. The survey documentation had been found legally conclusive. The conspiracy finding was more nuanced. Judge Harmon had not formally ruled on the conspiracy argument in its entirety because proving coordinated intent to the legal standard required evidence at a level that the current record approached, but did not fully achieve. What he had ruled on was each individual incident, and on each one he had found in Hollow Creek's favor: the well contamination as an act of deliberate property damage, the supply line interference as tortious interference with business relationships, The cattle raids as theft with documentation sufficient to name Prewitt's operation as the most probable source. The financial judgment was real. Not everything Crane had sought, but real and significant and directed at Prewitt specifically, whose exposure was the most directly documented. Bryce was not named, Galt was not named, Cosgrove was not named. The larger coordination was implied in the ruling without being formally adjudicated, which was the partial victory that Crane had prepared her for as the most likely outcome. She folded the letter and stood at the gate for a moment with the May sun on her shoulders and the north pasture green behind her in a way it hadn't been when they'd arrived here. "Good news?" Pete asked. "Mostly," she said. She went inside and wrote a letter to Crane with specific questions about the judgment enforcement and the implications for the outstanding land debt that the ruling might affect. She wrote letters to Abigail Foss, to the Garners, to the Vasquez brothers, to Birch and Sarah, outlining what had been decided and what it meant for each of them. She wrote these letters at the kitchen table, and her handwriting, which was normally very even, was slightly less so than usual. When Colt came in from the east section late afternoon, she had the letter sealed and the Crane letter sitting on the table, and she handed it to him without saying anything. He read it. He read it twice, which was what he did with important things. Then he set it flat on the table. "Prewitt," he said. "Yes." "Not Bryce." "No," Maeve said. "Not formally. Not yet. But the judgment's real." "It's real," Maeve said. "Enforceable. And it's on record. Everything that's on record about Bryce's involvement, the meeting with the San Antonio attorney, the timing, Cosgrove's connection to the land challenge, it's all part of the case file now. It exists." She looked at him. "People who want to do business with Bryce and who know how to look at public records will find it. That's not justice exactly, but it's not nothing." Colt was quiet. He put his hand flat on the table beside the letter. Not on it, just beside it. And he looked at the wall for a moment with the expression he got when he was doing the complete accounting of something. "We keep the land," he said. "We keep the land," Maeve said. "The cisterns, the herd, the rotation, all of it." He nodded slowly. "Then it was enough," he said. Outside, the May evening was coming in warm and clear, the light lasting the way it did in spring, generous with itself. From the barn, they could hear Amos making his evening rounds, the low sounds of cattle settling, the familiar work of the property continuing in the way it continued regardless of what happened in courtrooms or around card tables or in the back rooms of land agents' offices. The following Sunday, Deke Prewitt was seen leaving Harlan's Crossing in a loaded wagon, heading north. He did not stop to speak to anyone. The talk in town afterward was that the financial judgment had landed harder than expected, compounded by debts he'd been carrying and the bad season his own cattle operation had endured while his attention had been elsewhere. No one who told that story mentioned Maeve Holloway's name in connection with it. She heard about it from Ruth Garner, who had heard it from the dry goods merchant's wife, who had watched Prewitt's wagon roll past with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had kept her own opinions for 2 years and found the moment to release them had arrived. Maeve thought about it on the walk home from the Garners' property. She'd gone on foot, which she often did when she wanted to think without anything else requiring attention. 3 miles of road, the spring grass coming up on both sides, the air smelling of the season. She thought about what it actually meant, not the version that felt clean and complete, but the actual version. Prewitt gone, Bryce diminished but still present, the ranch stable but not secure in any permanent sense because nothing in this territory was permanent. The work would continue. There would be more problems. Some of them would be the kind she could anticipate, and some would be the kind that arrived with no warning in the middle of the night. She thought about the first morning she'd ridden into Harlan's Crossing on the buckboard beside Colt, and the 30 people on the boardwalks, and the sound Deke Prewitt had made outside the saloon. She thought about the brown notebook, the first page of it, written in the uncertain hand of someone who'd just arrived somewhere she wasn't sure she belonged. She didn't feel vindicated exactly. Vindication implied the argument had been with other people. The argument had always been with the problem, and the problem was mostly what it had always been: land and water and livestock and weather and the stubborn specific work of keeping something alive that had every reason to fail. She just also had to deal with the people at the same time. When she got back to Hollow Creek that evening, Colt was sitting on the repaired porch, the one they'd leveled in the first summer that didn't tilt anymore, with 2 cups of coffee, which meant he'd heard her coming up the road. She sat down in the other chair. Abigail Foss sent a message, Colt said. She wants to talk about a shared water arrangement for the dry season. Formal this time, not informal. When? Maeve asked. Whenever you're ready. Tell her next week, Maeve said. He nodded. They drank the coffee. The evening settled around the property in the gradual, unhurried way of a place that had decided, despite everyone's expectations, to persist. After a while, Colt said, "You know what Bryce said when word got back to him about the ruling?" Maeve looked at him. "He said the judge got it wrong," Colt said. "Said you had built a legal trap with all that documentation, and it wasn't real ranching, it was manipulation." "Of course he did," Maeve said. "He also said—" Colt stopped. He was looking at the pasture, at the cattle moving in the last of the light, at the operation that had been a drought-stricken failure 2.5 years ago and was something else now. "He said he underestimated you." "He said that?" Maeve said. "Not publicly," Colt said. "To Galt. Galt told someone who told Ernesto." He paused. "It's not an apology. It's not even close to an apology." "No," Maeve agreed. "But it's Harlan Bryce admitting he was wrong about something," Colt said. "In my experience, that's not a thing he does." Maeve held her coffee cup in both hands. It was warm against her palms, and the evening was cooling the way May evenings did, and the land around them was the land they had built into something, not without cost, not without setback, not without the particular human difficulty of 2 people trying to work together who hadn't expected to need each other the way they did. "I want to add 2 more cisterns in the fall," she said, "before the dry season cycle starts again, and I want to talk about the northeastern parcel. Birch mentioned he might be willing to discuss a grazing lease." Colt looked at her with an expression that she had learned over 2.5 years of close observation meant something specific. It was the expression he got when he was about to say something that wasn't practical, which he did rarely enough that she'd never stopped paying attention when it happened. "You know what I think about every time someone says you don't understand real ranching," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I think about the first day you walked the property," he said. "You'd been here maybe 6 hours. You didn't know the land yet, and you stood at the window over the kitchen basin and you looked at that dry creek bed and you said, 'Everything else is bad, but water is the worst problem.' And you were exactly right." He was quiet for a moment. Nobody who'd been here for 20 years had said that. Silas never said it. I didn't say it. You said it in 6 hours. Maeve looked at him for a long moment. The evening was fully down now, the stars beginning to show over the eastern pasture, the familiar night sounds of the property settling into their rhythm. "I had good reason to look carefully," she said. "I needed it to work." "I know," Colt said. "So did I." It was not a declaration. It wasn't designed to be. It was 2 people on a porch at the end of a long day, talking in the specific shorthand of people who have survived the same things and know, without having to make speeches about it, what that means. Inside the house, the brown notebook sat on the kitchen table. 43 pages in now, close written, the original water collection maps giving way to season records and herd notes and legal documentation references, and the kind of accumulated, specific knowledge of a piece of land that can only be built by someone who has paid attention to it every day for 2.5 years. It was almost full. Maeve had bought a second one from the general store in Harlan's Crossing 3 months ago. The shopkeeper's wife had not been silent this time. She had said, precisely and with the stiff dignity of a woman making a correction she'd been working up to for some time, "That'll be 15 cents, Mrs. Mercer." Just the transaction. Just the name. It was not an apology. It wasn't close to an apology, but Maeve had taken it for what it was. A small, dry acknowledgement that something had shifted. And she'd said thank you and put the notebook in her bag and walked out into the Harlan's Crossing Street where, 2.5 years ago, she'd ridden in on a buckboard and felt 30 pairs of eyes on her and said nothing. She still said nothing, walking out. But the quality of the silence was entirely different. The 2 additional cisterns went in that fall, as Maeve had planned, and the northeastern grazing lease with Birch was signed before the first frost. Informal in language, specific in terms, the kind of document that worked because both parties intended it to, rather than because it was airtight enough to survive a courtroom. Maeve had learned over the years at Hollow Creek to distinguish between agreements that needed legal precision and agreements that needed honest people, and she'd gotten reasonably good at identifying which kind she was dealing with before she sat down to write anything. The formal water arrangement with Abigail Foss took 3 meetings to finalize, which Maeve had expected because Abigail didn't finalize anything in fewer than 3 meetings, and would have been suspicious of herself if she had. The arrangement they reached was genuinely useful to both operations. A shared secondary reservoir on the property line between them, jointly maintained with clear allocation terms for drought conditions. When they signed it, Abigail said, without warmth but with complete sincerity, "This is the most sensible agreement I've made in 10 years of ranching." "High praise," Maeve said. "Highest I give," Abigail said, and meant it. What Maeve didn't tell Abigail, what she didn't tell most people because it wasn't the kind of thing she said out loud, was that the arrangement mattered to her beyond its practical value. The woman who had arrived in Harlan's Crossing with nothing but a brown notebook and a marriage that the town had already decided was a mistake was now building infrastructure that crossed property lines and would outlast the particular people who designed it. That was a different kind of permanence than surviving a bad season. That was the beginning of something that had roots. Harlan Bryce left the county in the spring of the following year. He didn't announce it the way men who leave in defeat sometimes announce things. No public sale, no formal farewell. He simply began, over a period of months, liquidating his interests. The feedlot operation went first, sold to a consortium from Austin that had been circling it for 2 years. The water rights he'd accumulated, the ones that had been the foundation of his consolidation strategy, were sold piecemeal, several of them purchased by Ernesto Vasquez, through a quiet arrangement that Maeve had helped structure and that gave the Vasquez family a legal water position they hadn't held in a generation. When Bryce's main property finally sold and he was gone, there was no celebration in Harlan's Crossing. Men like Bryce don't leave in a way that invites celebration. They thin out gradually, their influence retreating before their physical presence does, so that by the time they actually go, there's already a silence where they used to be. Colt heard about the final sale from Ernesto on a Tuesday and mentioned it to Maeve that evening on the porch. "Bryce is gone," he said. Maeve was quiet for a moment. She had a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, which was a habit she'd never broken. Starting things hot and letting them go cold because something else always required attention first. "How do you feel about it?" Colt asked. It was an unusual question from him. He didn't generally ask about feelings, which was not a coldness in him, but a respect for the fact that she processed things internally and would say what she wanted to say when she was ready. "I don't feel much," she said honestly. "I thought I would. I thought when he was finally gone there'd be something, relief or satisfaction or—" She stopped. "Mostly I just think about what we still have to do." "That's not nothing," Colt said. "That's actually the whole thing." She looked at him. "People who spend their lives waiting for the problem to be finished don't build anything," he said. "You've always been more interested in the building." She considered this. He was right, and she knew he was right. And there was something in being known accurately by another person, not flatteringly, not generously, but accurately, that she had not expected to matter to her as much as it did. She had spent a long time around people who saw only the surface of her and made their judgments from there. The experience of being seen past the surface without drama or announcement had taken some getting used to. "2 more hands start next week," she said, returning to the practical matter, which was where she was most comfortable. "I know," Colt said. "I interviewed them." "How did they seem?" "Solid. The younger one is greener than he let on in the interview, but he's got the right instincts. He'll learn." "Good," Maeve said. "We need someone trainable more than we need someone experienced right now. I'd rather teach the right habits from the start than spend a year undoing the wrong ones." Colt made a sound that might have been agreement and might have been amusement. With him, those were sometimes the same thing. And they sat in the cooling evening while the property moved through its ordinary rhythms around them. Well, the operation that Hollow Creek had become by its 5th year was not the same animal that either of them had been managing in that first desperate season. The herd had grown to 112 head, a number that would have seemed like fantasy on the night Maeve had first sat at the kitchen table with the account books and tried to calculate a path to viability. The grazing rotation had evolved into something sophisticated enough that Maeve had been asked twice to explain it to ranchers from neighboring counties who had heard about it and wanted to understand the methodology. She'd done so both times with the practical directness of someone who saw no reason to protect information that helped people manage land better, and both times the ranchers had come back afterward with specific follow-up questions that told her they'd actually implemented it, which pleased her more than the initial request had. The crew had stabilized at 14 people, which was the number the operation could support without strain. Not too few to do the work, not so many that the margins thinned. They had a bunkhouse that had been rebuilt properly, not the original structure that had leaned like it was apologizing for itself, but a solid replacement that the Crane brothers and Hector had framed over 2 weeks in the third year. The kitchen garden that Maeve had put in the first spring, modest, practical, nothing decorative, had expanded across 3 growing seasons into something that meaningfully reduced their food costs and provided enough surplus that Ruth Garner had taken to stopping by in August for the tomatoes, which were, Ruth said with the specific authority of someone who had been growing tomatoes for 30 years, genuinely exceptional. Maeve had no particular explanation for the tomatoes. The soil in that corner of the garden was good, and she watered it correctly, and she'd chosen the right variety for the climate. That was all. Not everything that worked had a complicated story. But it was Pete Grady who said it first, and he said it the way he said most things, without thinking too hard about whether he should, which was both his limitation and his particular charm. He said it at the end of a long workday in the 4th summer, when Maeve had spent most of the afternoon riding the perimeter with him to assess a section of the eastern fence that had been showing wear, and they were coming back in the cooling evening with the light going gold across the pastures. "You know what people say about this place now," Pete said. "I hear things," Maeve said. "They call you the one who built it," Pete said. "Not you and Colt, just you. Like it's your ranch specifically." Maeve rode for a moment without responding. "How does Colt feel about that?" she asked. "I asked him once," Pete said, with the specific courage of a man who has decided a conversation matters enough to have it badly if necessary. He said it was accurate. She didn't say anything to that. She looked at the fence line and made a mental note about the 3rd post from the junction marker, and filed Pete's information in the place where she filed things that required private processing. Later that evening, she said to Colt, "Pete told me what you said." Colt was at the table with the week's supply numbers, which he still reviewed because the physical operation was his domain in the ways that mattered to him. The equipment decisions, the fence work, the things that required the particular presence of a man who understood the ranch's physical reality from the inside out. "What did I say?" "That it was accurate," Maeve said. "That people calling it my ranch specifically was accurate." He looked up from the numbers. "It is accurate," he said. "It's your name on the deed," Maeve said. "My name on the deed means I'm legally responsible for it," Colt said. "That's not the same thing as who built it. I know the difference, and so do you, so let's not pretend otherwise." She sat down across from him. "It was both of us. I provided the property and the physical operation and the labor," Colt said. "You provided everything that made any of that work." He picked up the supply numbers again. "I'm not being modest. I'm being accurate. You're the one who told us water was the core problem on day 1. You're the one who built the legal record. You're the one who held the ranch the night I was stuck in Caldwell." He paused. "I've been a good partner to what you built. I think that's the honest account." Maeve was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them made his face look the way it always looked in that particular light. Solid, unhurried, a man who had arrived at his conclusions through long and honest consideration and wasn't interested in revisiting them for social purposes. "You're a harder thing to be around than I expected," she said finally. He looked up again, surprised. "How so?" "You make it difficult to argue with the facts," she said. "I've spent most of my life arguing with how people see me. You don't give me anything to argue with." Something crossed his face that she'd seen before. The internal equivalent of something he might, in different company, have allowed to be more visible. "Is that a complaint?" No, Maeve said. It's an observation. I'm still getting used to it. He nodded once, slow. Take your time, he said. There were things about Hollow Creek that Maeve had not expected and could not have planned for, and these were, in the end, the things she thought about most. She had not expected Sarah Dunmore to become, over 4 years, something that approached a genuine friend. The kind you don't make easily as an adult because adulthood doesn't offer the forced proximity of childhood that usually produces friendship. But Sarah came by the property regularly, initially for practical reasons, and then for reasons that became harder to classify. And Maeve found that she looked forward to it in a way that was unfamiliar and took some getting used to. She had not expected Dale to cry when his daughter was born. His wife had come to the territory after he'd established himself at Hollow Creek, and the baby arrived in the 4th year. And Dale, who was the most physically formidable and emotionally contained person on the crew, sat outside the bunkhouse with his daughter in his arms on the night of her birth, and made no attempt to hide the fact that he was weeping, which Maeve had walked past on an evening errand and not intruded on, but had thought about for days afterward. There was something in it, a big, weathered man reduced to complete honesty by something small enough to hold in his arms, that said something true about what people were actually made of beneath the parts they showed the world. She had not expected the particular shift that happened between her and Colt, which was not dramatic and did not announce itself and was therefore, she thought, probably the most real kind. It was not the arrival of something new so much as the gradual revelation that something had been present longer than she'd acknowledged. They had started as a practical arrangement and become, without ceremony, people who were genuinely necessary to each other, not in the desperate, dependent way that some people meant by that word, but in the specific way of two people whose actual lives had become structurally interwoven at a level that had nothing to do with the original transaction. One evening in the 5th year, sitting on the porch in the particular quality of late summer dark that she had learned was specific to this part of Texas, warm, slightly dusty, the stars close in a way they weren't elsewhere, she said, "I need to tell you something." Colt waited. "When we made this arrangement," she said, "I thought I understood what I was agreeing to. I thought it was a professional situation that also happened to involve living together. I had a very organized picture of what it was." "I know," he said. "I don't have that picture anymore," she said. "I don't know exactly what the picture is now, but it's different from what I thought." He was quiet for a moment. Across the dark pasture, the cisterns held their water in the particular silence of things that were doing what they were built to do. "When I went to find you in Caldwell," Colt said slowly, with the care of a man choosing his words because they matter, "I told you I'd listened when you talked. I meant it as a professional commitment." He stopped. "It stopped being just professional a long time ago. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure it was useful to say." "It's useful," Maeve said. "Then I'll say it," he said. "You're the most capable person I've ever been in a room with. I knew that from the beginning. What I didn't expect was to—" He stopped again, and she let him stop, because he was working through something genuinely difficult for a man who did not use words as tools of expression. "I didn't expect it to matter to me the way it does. Who you are, not just what you can do." The night around them was the same night it had always been. Indifferent, immense. The Texas dark that didn't care what happened beneath it. But sitting in it felt different than it once had, and Maeve was honest enough with herself to know that was not the night that had changed. "We should have talked about this earlier," she said. "Probably," he said. "We were busy," she said. "We're always going to be busy," Colt said. "That doesn't seem like a reason to keep not saying things." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't," or checked. What Hollow Creek became in the years that followed was not something either of them had planned in any specific way, which was probably why it worked as well as it did. Planned things had a shape determined in advance. What they built had the shape of what had actually happened, irregular, specific, bearing the marks of everything it had survived. The herd continued to grow, managed with the rotation system that had become, in the ranching community of that part of Texas, something people referred to by name. The Hollow Creek method, they called it, which Maeve found both accurate and slightly embarrassing, the way most recognitions feel to people who were too busy doing the thing to notice it was becoming notable. Families came to work there. Not just single hands looking for wages, but people who wanted to build something in one place, who had heard, through the specific word of mouth that circulates among working people about where they're treated as though they matter, that Hollow Creek was the kind of operation that made sense, that paid what it said, that made decisions that held up under examination. The crew of 14 grew to 18, and then to 22 over 3 years, and the bunkhouse expanded again, and a second small house went up on the northern edge of the property for the Crane brothers' families, because Ellis and Thomas had both married and both chosen to stay, which told its own story about what the place had become. Abigail Foss's operation survived 2 more drought years on the strength of the shared water arrangement and expanded in its modest way, and Abigail said, on a Thursday afternoon over bad coffee at the kitchen table, "I've revised my opinion of clever people." "Only clever people?" Maeve said. "Don't push it," Abigail said. The Vasquez family, with their new water position and the informal grazing coordination that had developed into something durable, finally had the legal and operational security that the family's decades of knowledge deserved, but hadn't previously had. Ernesto, who was in his 70s now and moved more slowly but thought exactly as clearly, told Colt one afternoon that his grandfather had ranched this land and hadn't died knowing it would be in family hands for another generation, and that he had something to say about who he held responsible for that. "Tell Maeve," Colt said. "She did the work." "I'm telling you," Ernesto said, "so you can tell her right, because you know how she hears things from other people." Colt did tell her right that evening. Maeve sat with it for a while without saying anything, and then she said, "His grandfather's land," and didn't say anything else, but the way she said it told Colt what it meant to her. The people who had laughed in Harlan's Crossing did not, in most cases, formally recant their position. People rarely do. What happened instead was the more ordinary human process of the past becoming inconvenient to remember, the way a prediction that proved wrong gradually stops being mentioned until the person who made it has convinced themselves, at some level, that they'd never said it. Hetty Blythe stopped giving her opinions on the Mercer marriage around the 3rd year, which was its own kind of statement. The dry goods merchant's wife said, in the 4th year, to a newcomer who'd asked about the Hollow Creek operation, that it was the finest ranch management in the county, without attributing any of this to luck or her own prior predictions, which Maeve heard about secondhand and found, without particular bitterness, entirely predictable. The thing about being underestimated Maeve had learned over 5 years at Hollow Creek was that it didn't stop feeling like something. She had expected that success would file it down, that enough evidence accumulated over enough time would make the original judgments feel distant and small. And they were smaller. She could say that honestly. The weight of what Deke Pruitt had called out from that saloon porch on the first day was not the same weight it had been. But it hadn't disappeared. It had become part of the record, same as everything else. The fence marker incident and the well contamination and the night of the raid. Part of the full account of what building this had actually cost and required. She thought about this on an October morning in the 5th year, walking the perimeter in the early light the way she still walked it, still with the notebook. The 6th one now. The first 5 filling a shelf in the office that Colt had built her in the 2nd year in what had been a storage room. The morning was cool, and the grass was recovering well from the summer, and the cattle were in the far rotation section, moving with the unhurried certainty of animals in good condition on good land. She stopped at the original cistern, the first one, built in that first spring with limestone and mortar and her own hands and Hector's, the one that had held 3/4 of its capacity after 2 days of modest April rain and given her that particular cold clarity of a calculation proven right. It was still there, still solid, still doing what it had been built to do. The stones had weathered to a color close to the land around it. In another 20 years, it would look like it had always been there. That was what she had been building. Not something impressive, something durable. She opened the notebook and wrote the morning's observations. Grass recovery rate, water level, the quality of the light, which told you things about the season if you'd been paying attention long enough. Her handwriting was the same close, even hand it had always been. The pages accumulated the same way they always had, one observation after another, each one specific, each one true, the shape of the whole emerging from the placement of its parts. There was a lesson in that, if you wanted to call it a lesson. She was not much for lessons stated directly, because the ones worth having were already built into the experience of living through the thing. But if someone had asked her, one of the young hands, or Sarah Dunmore's younger sister, who had started working the property this past summer and had her sister's watchfulness and her own variety of ambition, if someone had asked her what she'd learned from 5 years of building something out of a drought-stricken failure while everyone around her predicted the exact opposite, she would have said something like this: "People will tell you what you can't do with the confidence of people who have never tried to do it. The confidence is real. The authority behind it is not. The only argument worth making against it is the one made with your hands and your time and your specific, unglamorous attention to the problem in front of you. And that argument takes longer than it should. It costs more than it should. There will be nights when the math stops working, and mornings when the well is wrong, and seasons when the people you trusted most to leave you alone come at you instead. You will not handle all of it well. You will make decisions under pressure that you'll revise later. You will be angry in ways you don't show and frightened in ways you won't admit, and there will be moments when the distance between where you are and where you need to be looks like something that can't be crossed. Cross it anyway. One specific problem at a time, one correct decision at a time, one page of the notebook at a time. The rest takes care of itself, or it doesn't, and either way you will know that what you built was real." Maeve closed the notebook and walked back toward the house. The morning was fully up now, the sun above the eastern ridge, the property moving into its working day, the sound of the crew at the barn, the cattle shifting in the far pasture, the ordinary, specific noise of a place that was alive and intended to stay that way. Colt was on the porch with coffee, which had become, over 5 years, the most reliable thing she knew about mornings. "Fence check on the south section," he said, as she came up the steps. "I know," she said, "after breakfast." "Amos thinks the third post on the eastern junction is—" "I saw it last week," Maeve said. "I already ordered the replacement timber." He looked at her with the expression she knew meant he was about to say something that was going to land simply and mean considerably more than it sounded. She had learned to recognize it in the same way she'd learned to read most things about him, through paying attention, over a long time, to what was actually there. "Good," he said. She took the other cup of coffee from the railing where he'd set it for her, still warm, and sat down in her chair and looked out at what they had made. It was not perfect. It had never been perfect, and it was not trying to be. It was a working ranch in difficult country, built by imperfect people through imperfect means, carrying the marks of everything it had been through, the same way good timber carries the marks of the weather it survived. It would face more difficult seasons. The work would not get easier, only more familiar, and familiar was its own kind of comfort without being the same thing as safe. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was standing. In the end, that was the whole of it. And it was enough.